Good afternoon, everybody. Just give everyone a couple minutes to get in here, and then we'll get started on this. So we're going to be going through the EZ application today. And so I will either get someone to share the link for this EZ application on the SBA website in the chat here, or we'll share this afterwards and add it into the chat box so you guys can go and download that stuff. Just wait a little bit for get some people to join. Hopefully everyone's having a good day. Hopefully everyone is excited to learn about the PPP stuff. Maybe this will be the last one we have to do on PPP. We'll be done with it. Yeah, I won't miss talking about it. All right, let's see here. Just getting these forms pulled up so we can share the screen and kind of walk through this. Awesome. I see Allison posted the actual link to that. Steve says, we can only hope. I am with you, Steve. Cool. Awesome. So it looks like we got a good amount of people in here. And so last week we covered what happens and what we need to do if we are less than $50,000. If you got less than $50,000 in PPP funds, if that's you, go back and watch the one I did last week. We actually walked through an application for you. Anyone that got less than $50,000 has a easy application, a really easy application that should take you only a couple of minutes. Anyone that got over $50,000 is able to use two different options here. You can either use the EZ application, the 3508 EZ, or you can use the real 3508 long form. What we're going to be going through today is the EZ form. The long form, there's a lot of resources out there. There's tools out there that you can use, but really I don't see very many shops that have to use the long form. We should be able to just use this EZ form. Like I talked about before, we have 10 months after the 24-week period to do our PPP forgiveness application. There is still some talk that loans from $50,000 to $150,000 or $150,000 or less will have a little bit easier process to get the stuff forgiven. Maybe no paperwork whatsoever. Maybe it'll be an easier form. You know, what I'm telling most of my clients right now is go talk to your bank, see if your bank is accepting this. If your bank isn't accepting this already, then I think this is pretty straightforward and I think it's easy enough to do now. But what I want to do is kind of go down through here and take a look who's eligible to do the EZ form. And then I'm actually going to go step by step and do the EZ form. And then once I'm done all of that, I will open it up and you guys can ask some questions and stuff like that. You know, really my purpose today is a lot of people have been really concerned about this EZ form or really the PPP forgiveness in general. And the handful that I've done with my clients, they've said, wow, that's it. You know, it's not rocket science. You know, it's fairly straightforward to do. And so let's kind of get into this here. Let's see if we can do it this way. That's really small. All right, let's do the full screen here. Awesome. So this is the instructions for the 3508 EZ. Okay. What I wanted to use this is to show you who can do the 3508 EZ form. And so it says you, the borrower, can apply for forgiveness using the EZ form if you can check at least one of these three boxes below. So the first one on here is something I don't think is going to qualify for most people here. You're a self-employed individual, independent contractor, or sole proprietor that had no employees. If this was your situation, you probably wouldn't even be using this form. You'd probably be using that super accelerated 50,000 or less form that I did last week. Really, the answer that we're going to be looking for is this second option here. I did not reduce any hourly wages or salary of any of my employees by more than 25% during the covered period. And then we did not reduce the number of employees or average paid hours between January 1 and the end of the covered period. Okay, and so we got two things to unpack there. The first one is reducing the salary and hourly wages by more than 25%. And so this would actually be decreasing their hourly rate or their salary. So if you had someone that was making $100 an hour before COVID and you reduced it down to $75, that's a 25% decrease. Anything less than that, you're going to get in trouble for. I don't think most people in that situation, if you're really cutting down the hourly wage by 25%, you're probably going to have a lot of other issues, to come along with that. But the thing is that a lot of people are asking me about is, well, I reduced the amount of employees that I had. I came into this with 6 employees and I ended this with 4 employees. Am I not going to be able to use the EZ form because we cannot reduce our employees? We have to either keep the same amount or increase them. Now, when we talk about employees, we're talking about full-time equivalent employees. And so if you had a part-timer in there, a part-timer doesn't even count for a full employee. And so if you have a part-timer in there and you have 4 other full-time employees and you lose the part-timer, we're still going to have 4 employees there. And so you won't get penalized for that whatsoever. Now, for those of you out there that have shops and have people that you did lose, you have to really kind of take into consideration what were the circumstances that made me lose that employee. And so one of the things that you got to look on here is ignore reductions that arose from an inability to rehire individuals who were employees if the borrower was unable to hire similarly qualified employees for unfilled positions. And so one of the things here is if you lost an employee and you physically were unable to find someone to replace that position, there is a safe harbor election where you don't get penalized for that. And so if you are actively trying to hire someone and you just could not find someone to fill that position, then you're not going to be penalized for that. Another one that you will not get penalized for is if you have someone that quit. If someone quit, then that's not you letting them go. They made a decision to leave. Now, theoretically, you're supposed to give them a written offer that they want to get their job back. And so whether it's a text message, an email, a physical letter of saying, hey, Mr. Smith, your job is still available. If you would like to come back, you can. Now, obviously, if they quit, they're probably going to turn down that letter because they decided to not come back. Same situation if you have someone that retired. Same situation if you have someone that moved away. This is literally just you losing an employee. Now, if you are sitting here today thinking, well, Hunt, I have my PPP application I'm trying to do. I had 8 employees back when I started this. I have 7 employees now. Then I would probably try and get that 8th employee on by the time I do my PPP forgiveness application. That would allow me to do an EZ form. There's a lot of gray areas in all of this because no 2 situations are the same. I've heard a lot of different things. A lot of different people talk about what happens in this situation, what happens in that situation. And the SBA and the Treasury just haven't given us very good guidance on this. And so we're going to have to kind of use some of our own logic and some of our own interpretation of this to see what really makes a difference and see if it really does make a difference whatsoever. I'll kind of come back to that when we finish up this EZ application and show you what would happen if this person would have reduced their employees and if that would have even made a difference or not. Okay, we got some questions in here. We got some stupid questions. We got some good ones. This applied to self-employed rodeo clowns. Mr. Malloy, I wish you the best with your rodeo clown business. This does apply to you. So good question there. I reduced my employees after the 8 weeks. Can I still use the 24 weeks to calculate? And so technically, Jen, this is either at the time of the application or the end of the year. And so by the letter of the law of what I'm reading here, you would have to have the employees when you made this forgiveness election. And then Melinda, great question here. 2 part-timers equal a full-time equivalent employee. And so the way that they look as a full-time equivalent employee is they're saying 40 hours a week is a full-time employee. And so if you have 2 part-timers that work 20 hours a week, that would then create 1 full-time employee. So good question there. All right. So let's take a look at this application. And so this is what the application looks like. If you will notice, this looks very similar to what you saw for the original PPP application. This is what we call the 3508 EZ, and this is what we're going to be doing for anyone that didn't reduce their employees and anyone that didn't reduce their hourly wages. So one of the first things I want to point out is something that's caught a lot of people out is, do you see up here, It says expiration date 10/31/2020. Now, this was making a lot of people panic because they thought that this was going to be due here in 3 days. The SBA has came out and said, ignore the expiration date. It doesn't actually apply. It's just something they put on the paperwork. Now, I just downloaded this off their website this morning, so I don't know why they just haven't removed that expiration date, but even the SBA itself says you can go ahead and ignore that, okay? This first part of it's very straightforward, right? We're going to go down. We're going to do the business legal name. We're going to do the trade name, business address, tax ID number, business phone number, et cetera, et cetera. All very straightforward. The next thing that we got to do on here is we need our SBA PPP loan number and our lender loan PPP number. If you do not know that, just ask your banker. Your banker should be able to get that information for you. The next one on here is PPP loan amount. How much money did you get on the PPP? Very straightforward. What did they put into your bank? And so I'm going to actually go down through actual information here and fill this out using one of my shop's information. And so this shop got $63,300. So I'm going to put that on there. Now, PPP loan disbursement date. PPP loan disbursement date is the date that you got that money in your account. So whatever day that hit your account is the PPP disbursement date. That's also the start of the clock for the 8 or 24 week period. And so in my situation, I got that on April 13th, 2020. Employees at the time of loan application, we have 6 employees. Employees at the end of it, we had 6 employees again. Now this client had 6 employees started out. He had 1 part-timer, which doesn't count towards employees. And at the end of the period, he still had the same amount of people, so no change. If it went up, great. If it went down, then we won't be able to use this application. So we really want to figure out and find a way that we can have the same head count, maintain it, or increase it. A lot of questions about this because sometimes banks are having you do this on their online portal. And I know this client specifically, we had to do the same exact thing. And that employees at the time of the loan application number was not able to be changed on there. It was locked in there at 6 because a lot of people have came back and they said that, well, I didn't really know that it was only full-time equivalents. So I put in that I had 7 employees where really one of them was a part-timer. And what I'm telling people in that situation is if they won't let you change your beginning number and it was an incorrect number, then you need to make sure that you're calculating the end of the period the same way. And so for that example is if I inadvertently put in 7 full-time employees on my application and it won't let me change that, then I'm going to use that same method to calculate for the employees at the end of the forgiveness period, and I'm going to put 7 there. If I had lost someone because that they moved, they retired, they quit, whatever it might be, then again, I'm just going to keep the same amount of employees on there because we're not going to get penalized for it. It'll raise the least amount of questions, and that's the only way I've been able to do this without raising a flag. Because let's use this for an example. If I have 6 employees on there and I put 3 employees at the end of it, this is going to be a flag to the bank because they're going to come back and they're going to say, Hunt, you fired half of your employees. You're not able to use this EZ form. There's nowhere on here to put, well, I had 6 employees at the start and 3 employees at the end, but I lost 3 of them because they retired, they moved away, and whatever it might be. Now, some of these that allow you to change this, if you really did have 3 employees at the end, then maybe we go like this and we say, well, we had 3 employees at the beginning because the 3 that we lost actually don't count towards the reduction. Okay, and so this is a little bit kind of a confusing area, but the general idea that you need to remember is we want the same amount of employees or more. Okay, so I'm going to change this back to 6. Next question on here, idle advance amount. And so this is how much you got from the SBA for the economic injury disaster loan, but just the grant portion, not the full loan amount, just the grant portion. Now in my situation, my client got $6,000. Next thing we need to put on here is the idle application number. You should have got an email for that. I believe that when they deposit the money in your account, if you look on your bank statement, that they will actually give you a number. I'm going to put in a fake number here, but it's actually going to be very close to a real number so you can kind of see what it looks like. Most of these I've seen have started in 33, and it is what? 10 digits here. And so that's kind of the format of the number that you're looking for. If you don't have that number, you can call up the SBA and they'll give you that number. Sometimes there's actually a little bit of a wait time, but usually they're actually pretty good and pretty easy to get a hold of. Now, why do we have to put this EIDL advance amount in there, right? Because they told us this is going to be a grant. We do not have to pay this back. Kind of just like what happened with the PPP, it was a bit of a bait and switch. And so while that $6,000 amount that my client got is a grant and we don't have to pay that back, it's actually going to reduce the forgivable amount of my PPP. And so if I get all of this PPP money forgiven, $63,300, I'm still going to have to either give them the $6,000 back or I'm going to have to turn that into a loan and pay it back over 2 years. So whatever money that you got on that EIDL grant money, just like I said when this first thing came out, is set that money aside. We're going to end up probably having to pay that back or paying it back over the form of a loan. If you want to do a loan, then fine. You know, you're going to probably be able to stretch out over 2 years. It's like 1% interest. It's really cheap. If it was me, though, I'd probably give the money back, be done with it, and move on with my life. Now, the $6,000 is the only place that's going to be reflective on any of these numbers on this application. You don't have to reduce the forgiveness amount at the bottom. You don't have to adjust any of your other numbers. You're just strictly reporting in that box. I have not had someone get officially forgiven with the SBA, so we don't know how they're going to handle that $6,000. There's some talk that once the bank and SBA process this, that they'll actually send you, the business owner, a statement saying, hey, you owe us $6,000 back. And then there's some people that say that that statement's actually going to come from the SBA and you'll have to pay the SBA the $6,000 back. I've heard it both ways from 2 different banks, so we'll just have to see who we're going to have to pay back. But keep in mind, we're going to have to pay that back to someone. Okay. Next section on here, the frequency that we're paid to our employees. Pretty straightforward. Weekly, bi-weekly, twice a month, monthly. So in my situation, weekly. Okay. On this one, we're going to ask what the covered period is. And so the covered period is going to start when we got our money. And so the covered period starts on 4/13. And then what you have to do is you just have to calculate 24 weeks out. You want to use my spreadsheet, you can do that. You can do it online, calculate it. But the end of the 24-week period here is going to be 9/27/2020. Now, I've seen this question. I believe that this got asked in the last webinar that I did. If I used all of this in the 8-week period, should I still use the 24-week period? I would use the 24-week period no matter what, because think about you, put yourselves in the banker's shoes. In this situation, let's say that I had used all of my money in the 8-week period and I had used $64,000 out of the $63,000. So I'm going to be fully forgiven, but only by a couple $100. Do you think that the bank is going to scrutinize that more, or this situation where I've spent, 3 times the money? It's probably going to be a lot easier for everyone involved if we can use a 24-week period, because that will put us so much over and above. And really, as you'll see in a second here, we're only going to have to use payroll information. We're not going to have to use rent, utilities, any of that kind of stuff. Now, the next one on here is called the alternative payroll covered period if applicable. And so this has become less and less important because now that we're going to 24 weeks, most people are so over and above what they need to spend that they don't really care about the alternative covered period. What the alternative covered period is let's say for this example, I got my payroll on 4/13, but I'm on a bi-weekly schedule and my first payroll wasn't really till 4/28, let's say. What a lot of people were complaining about is saying, well, hey, I lost 2 weeks of my PPP time just because that's not how my normal payroll cycle runs. What the alternative payroll covered period allows us to do is saying, hey, instead of this starting on 4/13, I'm going to start my 24 weeks on 4/28. And then this would push it to, I'm using rough math here, but this would now then go covered to 10/15/2020. So essentially pushes this whole thing forward so it matches the next payroll date after you got your money. If you want to do that covered period, fine. Like I said, most of the time, it's not going to make any difference. We're going to be so over above. Maybe this will make us 3 times over the amount versus 2.5 times, but that's kind of the option. In this situation, we're not going to use the alternative period. We're just going to use the regular 24 weeks, so I can just remove that out of there. Next question here is if the borrower, together with the affiliates, if applicable, receive PPP loans in excess of $2 million, check here. I don't think that anyone on this webinar got more than $2 million, even in their, quote unquote affiliates. So I'm not even going to address that. If you got more than $2 million in PPP loans, you're probably not on this webinar. You're probably paying someone to do this because you're going to probably have a very, very complicated application here. And so then that gets us into the forgivable amount calculation. And so you can see on here, I'm going to go kind of down through an overview and we'll see how to figure this stuff out. And so what we need to do is we need to factor in how much we spent in payroll, how much we spent in interest payments, how much we spent in rent payments, and how much we spent in utility payments. We're going to enter all those amounts in here. And then we're going to total all that up, do some math on the PPP amount, and see if we spent enough on payroll. Now, since we're going to be using the 24-week period, a lot of banks have actually been requiring this, I've seen. They don't want you to use anything other than payroll unless you have to. I have not found a single situation where a shop was not able to use completely just payroll because most people have spent that much money. And so really, we're only going to be using payroll. We're not even going to be using retirement. We're not going to be using health insurance. The reason that we're doing that is that we're making the bank's life easier and we're making our lives easier. The reason that this is easier is because if we're only using our gross payroll, all I have to give the bank is a payroll summary. I don't have to worry about canceled checks to my 401k. I don't have to worry about canceled checks to my health insurance, rent, utilities, none of that stuff. We're just going to use payroll. And so what we should do here is if we're figuring out what our payroll costs are, we're going to need to get a report from our payroll provider. And so let me zoom in a little bit here so that you guys can see this. And so this is an example of a payroll summary that we're going to get out of any sort of software. This is an example that comes out of our payroll, whether you're on ADP, Paychex, QuickBooks, all of them are going to be very similar. The general idea behind it is I want to see the period, the date that is covered, and I want to split total pay, which is this column right here, by my employees. And so all of the employees are treated exactly the same. I took their names off of here and just put employee, but you will see that we have one owner on here because owners are treated a little bit differently. And so the first thing that I want to do, and the kind of handy thing here that I put this into Excel, is I'm going down through because I'm making sure that none of my employees made more than $46,000. So $46,000 is essentially $100,000 a year annualized over 24 weeks. It is perfectly fine to pay someone more than that much money over this 24-week period, but we can only use $46,153 towards forgiveness. And so I'm looking at all my employees here. None of them are over that $46,000 mark, so we're good. Now, owners have a different set of rules that they have to go off of here. And so you can take a look. This owner for the 24-week period, he made almost $40,000. And so what you need to do is you need to look at this and you need to figure out how much of that can we really deduct. And so this kind of gets a little bit complicated here, so I'll do my best to kind of make this make sense for you. And so the maximum amount that we can take for owner salary for the 24-week period is the lesser of the actual pay for the period, which is $40,000, the $20,833, which is just the max amount that the SBA allows us to use for the owner, or 2.5 times monthly payroll based on last year's wages. And so I'll give you an example here. Is if you made, let's say that you made last year, you only were on payroll for $20,000. Then you're going to be limited on 2.5 months of last year's average payroll because they're not going to allow you to give yourself a wage and give yourself more money and then use all that money towards yourself. As long as you maintained your payroll or you increased it, it's still always going to be maxed out on what you paid yourself this year. And so I'll put this back. He made $114,000, so we're good to go there. If you get into a complicated situation, you can always just say, you know what, I'm just not even going to include my owner's salary. Like, let's look for example here. We have spent $148,000 on payroll, if I take out his owner salary completely, we're still at $128,000. If all else fails and you don't need it, then just don't even put it in there, okay? But we are going to use that $20,833 amount because that's the max that we can take for any owner, okay? So what we then need to do is we need to take this total payroll amount. This is just wages. There's no payroll taxes in here, no employer portion of payroll taxes. There's no retirement. There's no health insurance. And so we're going to take that amount and we're going to put it in here, $148,450. Like I said before, mortgage insurance, interest payments, we're not going to have anything on there, so we're going to put 0. Business rent or lease payments, 0. Utility payments, 0, right? This is getting a lot easier. So then we need to add all this stuff up. Obviously, there's no adding to do, so we're just going to take the amount from line 1. We put in our PPP amount here. So we got $63,300. And then this last one here has kind of thrown up a lot of people. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that you spent at least 60% on payroll. We know that this is not going to apply to us because we've spent 100% of our money on payroll, but we need to do the calculation anyways. And so what's been happening is it's been throwing people off. They've been trying to multiply times 0.6. And so just read this line by line. And so what they want us to do is they want us to take line 1, $148,000, and divide it by 0.6. And that number is going to be $247,418,000. That's a ton of money, right? It's going to be much, much more than what we spent. And so then what we need to do here is it says forgiveness amount. Enter the smallest of lines 5, 6, or 7. Obviously, the smallest amount on here is going to be the PPP amount. So we put the PPP amount in there, which tells us, hey, my forgiveness amount is $63,300. You gave me $63,300. We are fully forgiven. Now, like we've talked about before, that $6,000 that we got on the EIDL is probably going to have to be paid back one way, shape, or form. But the PPP itself is fully forgiven. And really, that's the end of this. That's really the end of this here. As far as what we need to do here, we need to go to this next page and we need to initial some stuff. So the first one is saying that we use it to pay for eligible payroll costs, interest payments, etc. It does not, we use payroll for at least 60%, which we've already figured out we used 100%. If the 24-week period applies, this is what we were looking at before. It does not exceed 2.5 months of the 2019 compensation for any owner. And that amount is capped at, like we were shown on that spreadsheet, $20,833. Okay. If the borrower elected an 8-week period, which I'm not recommending anyone to do, but it's the same idea, but that amount is capped at $15,000, not $20,000. Next one here, understand that if we're using for an unauthorized, that they can come after me. This is saying that we did not reduce anyone's hourly wages by more than 25%. This is saying that I verified all the payments are eligible. This is saying that I have submitted to the lender any required documentation for payroll cost, et cetera, et cetera. The 2 reports that most banks are asking for payroll costs is a payroll summary, just like we use to get the actual information off of from your payroll provider or printed out of QuickBooks, and then usually the 2nd and 3rd quarter 941s. The dates don't fall exactly on our PPP dates, but that's what the banks are wanting to see. Again, we are certifying here on this line that if we do something wrong, they can fine us, sue us, imprison us. The next one here is saying that the tax documents that I sent, those quarterly payroll reports, are what I actually submitted to the IRS. So if you're out there and you're trying to play funny business saying, hey, I'm going to print out some bogus 941s and then I'll just give that to my bank and I'll submit other stuff, they're saying that that's not allowed. We know that. Obviously, that's illegal, et cetera, et cetera. The next one is saying that I understand that if the SBA ever asks for any more information, that I'm willing to give that to them. The last one here is it's saying that we need to initial at least 1. The first option here, and I'll give you kind of the cliff notes on it, is saying that we did not increase or we did not reduce the number of employees or average paid hours from the beginning to the end of the covered period, just like that we had went through before. If we had people quit, if we couldn't find employees, if we had someone retire, that does not matter. The next option is if you were unable to operate because of the Secretary of Health, the Director of Centers of Disease Control, OSHA. Really, this second option is for people that had a business where they were legally not allowed to open. I don't think that any shop would fall under that situation because we're an essential service business and you were not forced by a state or local government to shut down. Those of you out there, if you're watching this, you have a bar, restaurant, bowling alley, daycare, something like that, where it's saying, hey, for some or all of this covered period, I was legally, forced to close down, then you could check this box. You could you could actually initial both of these. You only have to initial one. Most shops are going to be in this category on option number 1. We're going to sign this at the bottom, print our name, date it, and title it, and that's it. We're done. That was kind of, we went through all that in a half hour. I think if you have the payroll reports and you have all this stuff ready to go, this should take you all probably about 10 to 15 minutes. Very, very straightforward. One of the last things that I wanted to that I've been explaining to some of my clients here, a lot of people are kind of getting concerned about, well, what if I reduce the number of employees? Does this fall into a gray area? Is this going to come back and bite me? Let's use this for an example. And so what ends up happening is if you reduce your employees, you get penalized. And so if I went from 10 employees down to 9 employees, I would be penalized 10%. And what that means is that they would lower down my eligible payroll cost by 10%. And so if I went from 10 employees to 9 employees, instead of having $148,000 there, we would maybe have $130,000 after that 10% penalty. You can still see that even with that 10% penalty, we're still over 2 times the amount that we had to spend. For the amount of employees that you would have to lose for it to be in a non-forgivable position is so massive. If you've really lost that many employees, then you aren't going to be able to use this EZ form anyways, right? Other stuff has happened. And that's where a lot of times I'm telling people to kind of be a little bit more aggressive maybe on how you justify maintaining your head count. Because really, if they ever were to come back and force your hand and say, well, you actually should have gotten a penalty for it, it's still not going to make a difference. It's still going to all be forgiven. And the long form is extremely complicated to do. There's tools out there to use it. I will post a tool on here a little bit later of one that I've kind of given out to people. Like I said, I haven't had a shop that has to do the long form. But if you are going to have to do the long form, do not try to do it by hand. Utilize on technology to do it because it can get kind of complicated kind of quick. Cool. So that is it. We got some questions here. And I will go down through it. Let's start down below here. Hey, Kim, not to ask a stupid question. Oh, I wasn't referring to your stupid question. I was referring to one of my friends asking about being a rodeo clown. So that was not meant for people actually here for real information. So cool. So we got, how do you know if you got the EIDL advance? You got the Maryland $10,000 grant. Is that part of this as an advance? So if you got the Maryland $10,000 grant, that is actually not the same as the EIDL grant. The EIDL grant came directly from the SBA. And so the SBA, the way that they did the EIDL grant money is they were giving you $1,000 per employee up to $10,000 if you applied for that EIDL grant. And so if you apply for the SBA disaster loan, then you would have got this grant depending on how many employees you had. Like I said, my client had 6 employees, so he got $6,000. Sean, another good question here. How do I type in PDF? Call me later. I'll show you how to do that. When we applied, I believe we counted owners into headcount. Is that correct? So Jen, here's the situation. And so technically an owner does not count into the head count. If you count them in the beginning, count them at the end. As long as we're comparing apples to apples, we're all good to go there. Steve, what if the EIDL came first and the SBA subtracted that $10,000 from the PPP? So if you already got that $10,000 subtracted from your PPP amount, I probably would still fill out this application exactly the same, but then I know that I'm not going to owe them any more money because they already got their $10,000 in PPP. I had a handful of banks do that exact same situation, but yeah, good question there. Let's see here. Lisa, one more question. If the employee's at the time of forgiveness application, is this truly the day that I fill out the application, or is this the number of employees at the end of my PPP loan period? And so this one is a little bit hard to figure out. And so I've seen it go both ways. What I'll probably say is use the date that benefits you the best, because if you look at the actual instructions on it, they mention multiple different times, even in the instructions alone. Some of them mention the end of the year, which how do we know how many employees we're going to have at the end of the year if we're filling this out now? Some of them mention at the end of the 24-week period. Some of them mention that the end of the 24-week period, which is also your forgiveness date, but we know that we wouldn't be able to turn it around all at the same time. Yeah, and so I hate to give you a non-answer there, but I just don't have a whole lot of good guidance on that. Let's see, and I think this relates to your other one. I'm kind of going backwards on here. So employees at the time of the loan application, this is full-time equivalent employees, not headcount, correct? So if we had 5 full-timers and 1 part-time that worked 20 hours, that would be 5 employees. Someone quit. How do we notate on the application? Just remove them from the initial numbers or some other process. There's nowhere to report this stuff. You just remove them from the original number so that we're comparing apples to apples and we're maintaining. Steve, what happens if you had to fire someone for insubordination and have not been able to replace them yet? For me, that would fall into the situation of, hey, I had to let someone go for cause, and I have not been able to replace them with a suitable member. And so that would technically not be subject to the penalization. Really one of the situations that they're trying to do here, and the overall idea, and what I just keep on trying to kind of explain to people, is the idea behind this of what they're trying to avoid is me giving Steve money. I gave Steve $150,000 into PPP. He turned around and said, perfect, I'll fire half of my employees and I'll just keep some of this money and I'll just pay those other employees and I'll just kind of pocket the rest of it. They're trying to reduce that. They know stuff happens. They know people are going to quit. They know people are going to get laid off. They know people are going to get fired. Are we trying to kind of keep up with the spirit of what the SBA is trying for us to do here? Greg, hey Greg, how are you? I feel it will all be excused for the fact SBA doesn't know what's going on. I'm guessing that you were talking about if someone quit and stuff like that. 100% with you, Greg. You know, as long as we're trying to do the right thing, as long as we're trying to maintain our head count, we know how hard it is in this day and age. If you have a technician that you have to fire, they quit, there's not like there's a long list of qualified candidates that we can go and pick and choose from. So we just got to do our best. Tammy, that kind of is that same question above. Hey, if we're trying to replace it and we can't find it, then you know what? That doesn't seem like we will be penalized for that. Kevin, I missed the first 15 minutes. Can we use a specific form if we received over 150,000? Yes, sir, you can. So this is anyone that got from 50,000 or above. I'm not sure if over 2 million, I think you might do a different thing, but I don't think any of us have to worry about that. So yes, you can use this form. We got this form 3245047. Is it considered a long form? Julie, I don't know the name off the top of my head, but if yours is more than 1 page, you got the long form. I believe the long form, they shortened it a little bit, but it's about 5 pages long. There's calculations of head count. There's a way to calculate penalties. Yeah. Scott, we maintain 5 employees for the 8-week period, but not for the 24-week period. Should we only do the application for the 8 weeks? If that's a situation and you don't intend to rehire and you didn't fall into one of those other positions where someone left, quit, and you don't plan to rehire them by the end of the year, then yeah, let's use the 8-week period. We got a $10,000 grant without asking. Is that the EIDL amount? And so, Philip, if that came from the SBA, then more than likely that's going to be the $10,000 grant money. If you got the EIDL loan as well, then that's definitely the grant money. If you're unsure about that, I would call up the SBA and just double check. But I don't see how you can say without asking, because in order to get the $10,000 SBA EIDL grant, you had to go on and apply. You know, it was a website that you applied through. When does this form have to be completed by? So you have 10 months after your 24-week period to apply for forgiveness. So in this situation, our 24-week period ended essentially at the end of September. And so we'd have 10 months after that. So technically, my client wouldn't have to do this PPP forgiveness form until June of next year. So we have a lot of time. Good question though. And that looks like all the questions that we have here. See if anyone has anything else on here. Yeah, and so I'll post that link for the long form for those of you guys that need it. If you want to look it up, it's the AICPA, which is the Association or American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. They have a PPP forgiveness tool. So if you want to Google that, AICPA forgiveness tool or PPP forgiveness tool, you can find that there. Awesome. Looks like that's all the questions that we have here. Hopefully this gave you a little bit more information. Really, I hope that a lot of you guys can kind of look at this and say, well, you know what, this is really not as bad as I thought. I think even the SBA saying that this should really take no more than 15 minutes, it's really not that much of a burden. Really, the only confusion that I've had on some of this stuff is getting onto my bank's website and kind of translating the numbers from this actual application to how they want stuff filled out, because sometimes it's not really split out completely. But really, all of them are essentially this same exact form, just split out a little bit differently. So my advice to you guys right now is, first and foremost, let's talk to our banks. Let's see what they want us to do. If they're not accepting it, I'm not in a rush to give it to them. If they say, hey, we are accepting it, we just started, maybe I'll give them a couple weeks so they can learn on some other people's. If they're up and running and they say, hey, our system's moving fine and we're already accepting this stuff, let's knock it out. Let's be done with this so we can move on with our life. One last question here and we'll call it a day. Just to be sure I'm using the check payroll total, we are using the gross pay. Yes, sir, we are using the gross pay. And then Laura, SBA number does not appear on the deposit. So I thought that it appeared on deposit. I was not that lucky. So if you don't know your SBA loan number, your grant number, and you don't have a statement because you don't have an idle loan, just call up the SBA. They're pretty helpful to be able to get that for you. And then last one on here, and I promise the last one. Will this session be available to review later? Yes, sir, or ma'am, I'm not sure who. This will be available on demand on YouTube and on Facebook immediately after this. So go back and watch as many times as you want. Awesome. Well, hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Hopefully this will give you a little bit more information. Oh, I got that wrong. It does appear. I read that too quick. So the SBA number does appear on the deposit. Thanks, Laura. But yeah, hopefully this gave you a little bit more information. Hopefully this will help you out when you go to fill out your application. Obviously, if you're a client of ours, you have any sort of issues with it, please feel free to reach out. Be happy to help you run through any of this stuff. And then, yeah, hopefully this will be the last of it and we won't have to hear about it and we'll be done. Everyone will be forgiven and we can just move on with our lives. I think that's just what, at this point, everyone wants to do. So stay safe out there. Thanks again for joining me and I will talk to you all soon.